Hey everyone, I'm going to be doing a different, instead of doing a sports podcast, I'm going to be doing one on the Roman Republic. Somebody at my church wanted me to do that, and there's a lot to it, so this is going to be just the first of a series of videos, and kind of what the first bout is really going to be more about the world that Rome came into and the different nations around Rome. So kind of more like, almost like, the way you can look at it like this, Rome's opponents or the world Rome existed in. I'll probably get a little bit into, if I have time, into how they took over Italy, but mostly kind of focus on what the world was like, what the culture was like, and kind of a build up to Rome. And first big thing, you had the Bronze Age, and in the Bronze Age, you had Egypt, the first Babylonian Empire, and the Hittites. And there were several other empires, and they all just collapsed at one time. It was like a big dark age. Only Egypt technically survived, but they were very weak and they never were great again. And the Hittites and the Babylonians were both gone. The Babylonians were called a different people. They're called the Kassites. Later on, you had the Chaldeans, which is the Babylonian Empire that I'll talk about in a minute. But over the course of time, you had the first of what's called five great ancient empires. The first one was the Assyrians, and the Assyrians were based in what's now northern Iraq. They had Nineveh was a big Assyrian city, and Ashur was a big Assyrian city. They were notorious for their brutality. They were over time when they took nations, they were very extreme. I don't want to get kind of into it, but they're really extreme in their brutality, and it scared people to give in. And that was one thing that the ancient world, very different from our world, this idea of using brutality both in warfare and in capital punishment to drive fear to get people to submit to your state. And some of that you'll see passes to Rome when we get to them. Maybe not, they weren't near as extreme as the Assyrians or some of the people that came before them, but they have a little bit of that in their culture. A second thing that really passes from Rome, from these ancient empires, and I'll get a little bit more in history of the successor states to Assyria, but was this idea, this religious idea that the gods back then, a lot of these empires, even going back to ancient Egypt and the Bronze Age, even before this idea, and you see it if you read accounts from the time, if you read from even from the Bible and stuff, this idea that your civilization, your loyalty to your God determined the outcome of your civilization. So that they were so strict on that they considered breaking religious vows or not worshiping the gods properly, or God, or whatever your faith was. They were so strict on that they would actually punish people for being I guess the medieval term would be heretic. They didn't call it back then, but they considered it like a treason against the state. The Roman Republic was no different. They had the different Jupiter and Saturn and Venus and all the different people. We named the planets after a lot of the Roman gods. And Mars, who was kind of like Ares, and a lot of them alluded to. I think it was historically, it kind of emerged separately from the Greek religion, but as time went on, they kind of merged their gods as Rome got more and more incorporated into the Greek world, which I'll get to that because they came into a Greek world when they came into existence. But so they had the gods and the Vestal Virgins and the Pontifex Maximus, and a lot of this stuff transpires into later on medieval Europe and Christian culture. And the fact that even in medieval Europe, it was, if you weren't a true Catholic, you weren't loyal to the crown. You see that specifically in Spain, a good example with Isabella and the Spanish Inquisition, or the Holy Roman Empire at times when the Habsburgs persecuted Protestants. So this idea goes all the way back to ancient times. So you'll see as we get into Roman culture, they were heavily influenced by the people around them. Crucifixion was not a Roman penalty. It actually was originated in Greece. And there was a lot of other stuff. It wasn't pure Roman. And in fact, as I get into this, especially the early Roman Republic, which I consider like culturally when Rome was the strongest. By the time they got to Caesar, they're decadent and corrupt, and I'll get into that, especially in the third video. But by the time even Julius Caesar was even born, Rome was already different from what I call the cultural golden age of Rome, which is the Romans that fought the First and Second Punic War and really allowed Rome to emerge as the power of the Mediterranean. But as you go through this, you got the religious impact of the state. You got the brutal world that they entered into with slavery and all this stuff, and it impacts a lot. Especially you can see the later Roman Empire it impacts a lot of their culture. So the world around them impacted them, and they impacted these other cultures. And Rome was also notorious for adopting the ideas of these of other cultures. They adopted their building, their architecture from the Etruscans. They adopted their metalsmithing from the Celts. Their written historical records from the Greeks. The Greeks were one of the first major civilizations to document everything historically, and that's when you get, while accounts before Greece, specifically like an empire like Persia, who was very powerful and very broad. I'll get to them later as I go through this as well. They were just as powerful and just as influenced as Greece. They didn't write things down like the Greeks did, so we hear a lot more about Greek history than Persian history, and the Romans that took that as well. They adopted a lot of the Greek ideas on writing, on theaters, and on drama, on playwriting, and you get a lot of his actually fictional writing coming out of Rome as well. So they adopted a lot of other culture. The shipbuilding they adopted from the Carthaginians. We'll get to that in the First Punic War. But and after the First Punic War, Rome was a Mediterranean superpower, naval power. I can talk about that. It's kind of not highlighted very well, but Rome became the dominant naval power after the First Punic War, and they never gave that up. They were great at seamanship. Something they didn't even know going into the First Punic War. It's very, very interesting how they. I grant that's another video, but so all the stuff they adopted from their culture around us. That's why it's kind of important to go into how the world built up prior to Rome and what people thought, how people thought about state, about life, about everything, because that influenced the Roman Republic and later the Roman Empire and even into the medieval world and into our world today. Some of these ideas have floated along all the way into the modern world. But so kind of you had the Assyrians. They were the first of the great superpowers of the ancient world. They conquered effectively a lot of what's now the Middle East. They conquered all of Iraq, which Samaria and Babylon. They brought conquered Susa, which is kind of going a little bit in Iran. And there was another great Iranian power, the Medes, who we'll get to in a minute. The Syrians had them as a vassal state. They went into what's now Turkey, conquered a lot of areas up in there. They controlled all of what's now Syria. And part of their homeland, they were kind of spread between Iraq and modern-day Syria. They went down into Lebanon, conquered a group called the Phoenicians, and I want to get into them a lot because they play a big part in both Rome and Greek history. They conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, the Moabites, the Edomites, the Philistines, the Amorites, all those nations in the Bible that gave the Jews grief. They never conquered the kingdom of Judah. Keep that in mind. They even went into Egypt and for a while controlled Egypt. So Assyria was a major superpower. A few things they innovated in warfare that hadn't been seen before was they were great at besieging cities. They invented stuff like the battering ram and the siege tower. So you see the siege tower, you roll them up the wall and people climb. Assyrians started that. Catapults came along before Assyria. There's documents of ancient Egyptians and stuff having them, but the Assyrians used them as well. They used battering rams. They were well equipped at taking cities versus powers before them. They were the first to really use horsemen. Prior to them, people used chariots, but they didn't use horsemen as much in battle. So the first instance, now they didn't have the stirrup. That was a later invention in the medieval era, which allowed riders to bend over, or the lance or spears, or actually engage on the horse. So a lot of early horsemen were mostly what we call skirmishers, an ancient military term. And skirmishers use like an archer, a peltis. They throw in spears. They're usually a ranged enemy. They engage. So the Syrians probably likely used horse archers or used horsemen to roll around, jump off of them with swords, and fought that way. So they were very. They did keep records. But they kept them in obelisks. So they'd build these obelisks and they would write about their battles and stuff. So the Syrians were kind of the first major superpower, and their cruelty kind of caught up to them. There was a revolt by one of its subjects when they started getting weaker, which was Babylon and the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans allied with the Medes. And this is about the time when Nebuchadnezzar, who's, if you study the Bible, is kind of famous in the Bible, but his dad is kind of the one that led the Babylonians, but there's this battle of Nineveh, which at the time was the capital of the Assyrian Empire, and they defeated the Mede-Babylonian alliance, defeated the Assyrians. knocked them out of power. And then Babylon came along, although the Medes got the Turkish part. So the Assyrian Empire was kind of split between the two, but a lot of the more prominent regions went to Babylon. I'm assuming because Babylon was considered the stronger of the two, because that so Babylon took like Syria, Israel. They actually did defeat the kingdom of Judah and took the Jews into captivity, as recorded in the Bible. And for the most part, the only group in the Levant, which is the Levant refers to like Lebanon, Israel, Syria region today, that area along the coastline. But the only peoples that was really kind of left alone were a group of people that called the Phoenicians. They were called that by the Greeks. They didn't call themselves that, and they were several city states along the coast of Lebanon: Tyre, Sidon, Ashdod, and different stuff. So that was kind of. Hey everyone, I'll do a cut there, but I had a daughter emergency. Actually, this is the second time I filmed. I got interrupted another time when I was filming as well. So kind of, I think we had gotten into Babylon at this point. Babylon was pretty short-lived. They weren't around. They were notorious for their wealth and their power, and they kind of followed the Assyrians, were really brutal. And what happened was there's a small herding tribe in southern Iran, which called themselves the Persians, and they had this great leader rise named Cyrus. And Cyrus started warring and taking over tribes around him, and eventually he grew Persia. Then they eventually took the Empire of the Medes, which I talked about earlier. He beat them in battle and then caused like a union of them. He kind of merged with them, and he was notorious for being one of the greatest leaders. He was apparently very popular, very fair, very generous leader. Even the Bible projects him, and Jewish culture projects him as a very fair leader. And the Medes almost considered him better than their current king once he took charge. And you'll see the same thing happen when I get to Babylon, where he's considered a strong ruler, a good ruler, and the Mede Empire basically becomes part of his empire. And we called it the Medo-Persian Empire. It's often used now, the Achaemenid Empire. So this is the third of the superpowers, and they would be big. Then they entered Babylon. He famously unflooded there's a stream that went into the city, and they discovered, and they were able to clog the stream. They stormed through. Oh no, they dried it up. They stormed through the. Trying to think of that. The entrance of this actuary and aqueduct kind of deal. Not an aqueduct. It was on the ground, but it's kind of like I can't think the word. But it's kind of like the water supply going in the city. They stormed through there, the tunnel, and they entered the city that way, and the Babylonians were overwhelmed. And then there was apparently a battle. I can't remember if it was before or after the siege of Babylon. I have to look it up again, but where the whole Babylon army just surrendered to him because they thought he was better than the king they had. So once he started taking control, there wasn't a whole lot of resistance from Babylon. I think it was Belteshazzar was overthrown, and that was the end of Babylon. And so the whole Babylonian Empire didn't fall to him, and he ruled an empire that basically, it did not control Egypt, because Egypt had broken away from Babylon and Assyria, and they were still kind of independent, but they weren't that strong. And they'd actually fought. Pharaoh Necho had fought Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon and was defeated, but they were still independent. And but Persia kind of went on, and he took over a lot. Almost all of what's now Turkey. And this would get them into trouble later on. They took over a group of city-states along the coast of at the time it was called Ionia. I want to call it Ionia, but it's modern-day Turkey. Nobody called it Turkey because there were no Turks there at the time. Turks wouldn't be there until the Middle Ages. But he took over what's called the Kingdom of Lydia, which is almost a Hellenistic kind of kingdom. Its capital is Sardis, and then he took over Greek city-states on the coastline, like Ephesus, Halicarnassus, Miletus, and all that. And they stopped there. They stopped at the Aegean. But some of these Greek city-states ended up being a constant thorn in the Persian Empire moving forward, as they would trigger the wars between Persia and Greece that are pretty famous. The Persians eventually conquered Egypt. They even went into India and the Afghanistan area. Afghanistan was called Bactria back then. And there was a place called Gurdosia, which is kind of in Iran, kind of in Pakistan. And then you went further into Pakistan. That was considered India at that time. So they were a massive empire. Hey, I just want to do a quick cut in here. I'm actually wearing my Tennessee jersey because they're playing basketball, playing Alabama right now, but it's halftime. I was kind of reviewing and editing the Persian part, and I left some stuff out about them that I want to kind of get into culture and stuff. And this is kind of big going into it, so I want to kind of get in a few things. First off, they had a very unique religion. It's actually a religion still around today called Zoroastrianism. It sounds very familiar if you hear it, especially in the ancient world. 'Cause there weren't a lot of monotheistic religions. Well, Zoroastrianism, just like Judaism, believed in one God. It believed if you were good, you would go to something like a heaven. If you're bad, you're going something like a hell. And it's the traditional ancient religion of Persia, Iran. And interestingly, I'm trying to fix my shirt a little bit. But interestingly, that was kind of the religion they believed in, which allowed them to interconnect very well with Judaism. Another part that I kind of thought was this is really what I want to interject is that the Persian Empire, one of its greatest strengths was its administrative state. They had very good, they divvied up into states, they called satraps, and you had a governor satrap that he ruled each state. Then you had like a low king, which kind of like ruled multiple satraps, and then a high king, which was the real king. And and they did allow some local rules. You can even kind of get this in the Bible with Zerubbabel and Jeshua and stuff. So Zerubbabel being like the king of Judah kind of deal, and you also hear about other kings around them, even though all those lands were Persian owned. So they had a very detailed administrative state. It was also very much a monarch. It was a very centralized state, and everybody reported up to eventually to the high king, who was the king of Persia. And this system was so strong that it was copied by the Greeks. That's where the term diadochi came. It was kind of a version of the satrap. It was it referred to a localized ruler, like Ptolemy was the diadochi of Egypt. Antigonus was the diadochi of Phrygia and Lydia, and you kind of had that was what we're referring to, is that all these generals of Alexander would take their region, build up their army, build up their power base, and then spread and try to fight over Alexander's empire, and that's kind of how that worked out. And so the Persians had a very good and very strong administrative state, and it kind of the Romans kind of propagandized because when they were going into the east, like the regions of the Middle East, and I call it east because the eastern lands, they had different kind of culture and tactics back then, but it'd be like places like Syria, Iraq, Iran, even kind of going into like the Russian area, like Ukraine and the Caucasus and stuff. So they would all kind of, and even agree a lot was not Turkey. So, but the Hellenic Macedonian empires were very monarch heavy, and they basically were modeled after the Persian administrative system. That's how good it was. And Persia actually had a postal kind of system where they could do telegram letters or paper scrolls they could take between regions. They kind of built something like a road system. It wasn't nowhere near the Roman one, but it was pretty efficient. So they had ways to communicate and logistically cross their empire very well. They had it very well organized and administrated. And when Alexander took it over, he kept it all in place. He put his people. Sometimes he put Persians in charge. Sometimes he put Greeks in charge, and and then Seleucus, who eventually took over that region, did the same thing. And he was notorious. Seleucus was notorious. He actually kept his Persian wife, and he was very good at winning over the hearts of Babylonians and Persians because he ruled in Babylon. But kind of the fact is that the Persian Achaemenid Empire was responsible for that kind of stable administrative state that the Greeks and even the Romans sometimes, the late Eastern, like the Byzantine Empire, kind of copied some of that. It wasn't the Roman Republic, but so they were very inspirational in putting together like a very administrative. No empire before them had been able to have such that detailed level organization and cataloging and working together. And like I said, they didn't document history as well as the Greeks. That's why we're learning more and more about them. And historically, a lot of our records from Persia came from Greece. But this is something I wanted to cut in. Also, when I was talking about the Etruscans earlier, and I'll talk about them again later in the video, you'll find out they were actually unique because they invented concrete. I was thinking about their building style stuff. That was the big. I thought about that after, and that was they were the first to actually truly invent concrete. That specifically the ones the Romans used in their roads and in their buildings and stuff. So, you can see how all these different cultures, Rome's just growing up, they're learning from, they're building on that. So, but this was just kind of a quick cut in edit on this part, specifically geared at the Persians, but I'm talking about how they were very inspirational in their administrative system. So, and of course, them being the third, then you get the Greeks were the fourth, and Rome will be the fifth of the great ancient empires. But thank you, everyone. I hope you're enjoying this, and I think I kind of cut it right before I go into the military tactics of Persia, which you'll find out weren't as strong as the Greeks. I'll get in that in a minute, and that's how the Greeks were able to beat them. And used a lot of ancient tactics, but militarily they relied a lot on chariots, horsemen, so kind of the Assyrian stuff. Then they also had infantry with spears and shields, but they didn't have this specialized infantry. And their naval power, and this is what becomes important. There was two great